Welcome to this explainer. I'm so glad you're here today because we're bypassing all the usual pleasantries and jumping straight into the hidden mechanics of global governance. We are looking at the architecture behind how the world actually makes decisions on one of the most critical issues of our time. And trust me, the reality is far more secretive, chaotic, and honestly fascinating than you might think.
Okay, let's dive into this. How on earth do you get over 190 different nations, countries with drastically different economies, political systems, and domestic interests, to actually sit down and sign a single planetary agreement? Just think about the logistical and diplomatic puzzle of getting that done. We usually only see the final handshakes and the polished press conferences, right? But the path to get there is fraught with high-stakes tension and backroom maneuvers that almost never make the evening news.
To give you a sense of just how intense things get, listen to what a top EU official said behind closed doors during the 2015 Paris Agreement negotiations. Away from the cameras, the reality of international power dynamics really takes center stage. To get a truly global deal, diplomats knew they had to make massive concessions, even if it meant compromising on the legal teeth of the treaty itself. The stakes literally couldn't be higher. But to really understand Paris, we first need to zoom out and look at a monumental flaw in how the world handled this issue for decades. Section 1. The governance disconnect. Energy versus climate. For a really long time, the global macro architecture had this absolutely massive flaw, where the root cause of climate change and the policies designed to fight it were governed as if they existed on two entirely different planets. 168. That is the staggering multiplier of how much global CO2 emissions from fossil fuels increased from the dawn of the Second Industrial Revolution in 1850 up to 2019. We're talking a jump from 19.8 megatons to a massive 33.3 gigatons. It's an unprecedented explosion of carbon, and it was driven entirely by the way humanity produces and consumes energy. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why treating climate and energy as separate issues is just an absurdity. Roughly two-thirds, 66% of all greenhouse gas emissions today are directly connected to energy and fossil fuels. You simply can't solve the climate problem without fundamentally revolutionizing the energy system. Yet historically, that is exactly what the world tried to do. Look at how countries structurally approach this. In official UN climate negotiations, nations would historically send diplomats from their environment or foreign ministries. But meanwhile, the actual source of the problem, the coal, the oil, the gas, was managed completely separately by energy and natural resource ministries. This compartmentalization existed at the national level and the international level. The people tasked with fixing the climate literally had no authority over the energy that was breaking it. Section 2. Rise of international bureaucracies, forcing integration. So a massive shift is underway, and interestingly, it isn't primarily being driven by individual countries waking up to the problem. Instead, this massive disconnect is finally being solved by the autonomous actions of global bureaucracies, organizations like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the IEA, and the World Bank. Academics refer to this phenomenon as governance integration. Now, I know that sounds like dense academic jargon, but let's break it down into plain language. It essentially means that these giant, previously siloed organizations finally started to merge their climate and energy strategies. They're connecting the dots and forcing policies to align across different sectors. So the crucial point is, how did these rigid bureaucracies actually change? Well, research by Harold Hubohm points to four specific factors. First, the global policy environment changed, which created new challenges and opportunities. Second, these bureaucracies were granted enough autonomy from their member states to make independent moves. Third, they made structural changes, like creating new internal units and hiring cross-disciplinary experts. And fourth, entrepreneurial leadership at the top redefined their goals to bridge that gap between energy and climate. They essentially forced integration from the inside out. Section 3. Paris, behind closed doors, the diplomatic reality. All right, having looked at this macro-bureaucratic theory, I want to pivot us down to the micro level of action. Let's drop directly into the restricted access rooms of the 2015 COP21 negotiations to see how these integrated agreements actually get hammered out. To do this, we're drawing directly on the remarkable research of Radoslav S. Dimitrov. And what makes this source so incredible is that Dimitrov wasn't just some academic observing from a distance. He was an actual delegate on a government delegation during the Paris conference. He took firsthand notes on the secret bilateral consultations, which gives us an unprecedented backstage look at how international law is truly forged.
The very first thing to understand about Paris is the tightly orchestrated restriction of access. To overcome 20 years of pretty acrimonious failures, the French presidency set up a highly controlled environment. They started with 24 simultaneous spin-off groups working in the first week, but by the second week, access was slashed to just 4 special passes per delegation for the key meetings. It became so restricted that major countries like Germany literally had to beg and borrow passes from smaller countries just to keep their diplomats in the room. Imagine top-tier diplomats essentially scalping VIP tickets just to help save the world. Section 4. Secrecy, Persuasion, and Compromise. How the sausage gets made. That restriction we just talked about, it was entirely intentional, and it transitions us perfectly into the specific tactics used to actually get a deal done. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is Dimitrov's first-hand account of what he calls an invisible meeting. He describes being in a tiny 5-by-5-meter room with only 10 individuals to review a secret deal between the US and Saudi Arabia. No paper copies allowed, no photos permitted, and absolutely no official record kept. His delegation was just asked to accept or reject the text shown on a small screen. Even wilder, when the official draft was distributed later, it contained text that was the exact opposite of what they had privately agreed to. The whole strategy was to limit the actors and avoid provoking early opposition, basically throwing privately negotiated pieces into the final text at the absolute last minute as a take-it-or-leave-it deal. And the pressure in these secret rooms was just immense. Less than 24 hours before the end of the conference, some wealthy nations actually wanted to reverse their climate finance pledges. It threatened to wreck the entire agreement right there. It all came down to a dramatic 11th-hour plea from a European diplomat begging their peers not to let historians write that they ruined the global response. This raw emotional persuasion worked, and they ultimately secured a financial commitment from a floor of $100 billion per year. Sometimes the biggest compromises come down to literally a single word. Minutes before the final session, the United States demanded that the word shall be changed to should regarding economy-wide emission reductions for developed countries. Now, it might seem like a minor edit, but legally, it's massive. It drastically weakened the legally binding nature of the mitigation commitments. The start of the final session was delayed for 90 minutes while this was debated, and it was eventually hastily slipped into the final document, disguised as a technical correction alongside some punctuation changes. They basically snuck a massive legal loophole in with a misplaced comma. Section 5. Winners, Losers, and Words. The final tally. Look, the diplomatic reality is that to reach a consensus among over 190 nations, everyone has to give something up, and everyone has to take something home. Let's evaluate the final balance sheet of this historic agreement. This matrix lays out exactly how the puzzle pieces fit together through mutual compromise, and we're reporting this impartially exactly as the delegates experienced it. The U.S. successfully weakened the legally binding nature of mitigation, but lost out on forcing mandatory progressive evolution of policy. China secured a favorable differentiation from developed nations, but in exchange, they had to concede to much stronger international transparency and global stock-taking than they originally wanted. The EU got its robust transparency and finance framework, but failed to secure the strict quantitative global emission targets it pushed for. And the island nations, well, they successfully got the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit written in as an aspirational goal, which was a huge victory, but they lost their fight for binding institutional compensation for irreversible loss and damage. Section 6. A new hybrid era. Looking forward. Let's move to and see how this builds into the overarching result of this incredibly messy, secretive, and integrated governance process. What did all this compromise actually build? It built a fundamentally new type of global treaty. The Paris Agreement is a true hybrid. It pairs bottom-up, laissez-faire national policies, where governments get to decide their own domestic energy and climate actions, with a rigid, top-down international system of legal transparency and review. So, despite its compromises and despite the lack of strict punitive enforcement, it really represents a monumental shift. Thanks to the integration driven by those global bureaucracies, energy and climate policy are no longer operating on separate planets. They are finally being forced to answer to one another on a global stage. Which leaves us with a really fascinating paradox to ponder. A global, highly public, multilateral treaty aimed at solving a planetary crisis was only made possible through extreme exclusion, tightly restricted access, and highly secretive backroom diplomacy. So, I leave you with this final thought to consider. Does secretive diplomacy effectively save the planet by forcing necessary compromise? Or does it risk undermining the very public trust needed to actually implement these massive changes? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking the hard questions.